But later on in the afternoon, there's a fascinating debate in Westminster Hall on carbon capture and storage, being led by Browne MP. Could this be the key to ensuring we maintain a thriving economy alongside those net zero ambitions? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now in the studio by the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the environment, Browne MP, of course, for South Cambridgeshire. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you. Good morning.
You're leading a debate today on something that has been contentious in many environmental circles. There are some people, particularly in the Green Party, particularly in the environmental movement, who say that carbon capture is just an excuse to allow fossil fuels to continue to be burnt. But you see it as more of a solution.
Absolutely. In fact, when I was an environment journalist at The Observer, at the Times newspaper, I remember writing a story about 20 years ago about carbon capture and storage, this newfangled thing. And I phoned up an environment group, I'll spare their blushes, and said, "What do you think about it?" And they said, "We don't like it." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "I haven't worked it out yet." And I then did a story about 2 months later. I phoned them up again saying, "I'm doing another story on carbon capture and storage." And they said, "We've worked out why we don't like it now." So yes, you're right, it's been contentious. Carbon capture and storage is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it underground. It's basically like natural gas, but in reverse. With natural gas, you take natural gas from under the North Sea in our case, and we then burn it and it ends up in the atmosphere. It's doing it in reverse and burying the carbon permanently underground. And the technology has been around for about 25 years. There's a plant in Norway that takes 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year. It's been burying it underground. It's reduced Norway's emissions by 3%. The process, though, is actually a very natural one. It's what nature does by itself. Life, whether plants and bacteria, they take in carbon dioxide, they make their bodies and plants out of it, and they bury themselves underground as oil, coal, gas, and carboniferous rocks and chalk and so on. And that's what's been happening for 3.5 billion years, is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting it underground. So it's a completely natural process. We're giving nature a bit of a helping hand. But the reason why some environment groups, and not all of them, some of them are quite pro it, but some of them have reservations about it, is because they're worried that it means we'll use it as an excuse not to cut back on driving petrol cars and not insulating our homes and everything else. And my message is that actually all those things are happening anyway. I mean, you look at all the measures that the government announced yesterday on moving to heat pumps from gas boilers, for example. That is happening. There's no way we can get to net zero by 2050, which is our target, just relying on CCS technology, which is still very, very new. But what CCS can do is help with those sectors where there is no alternative at the moment. So making steel, for example, there is basically no alternative than using fossil fuels to do that at the moment. But if we want to carry on with steel industries and cement industries and chemical industries, which I think we do, unless we want to go back to the Middle Ages, unless we want to force them to move overseas, which there's no point, because that will just lead to carbon leakage, as it were, other countries polluting, then we'll need CCS technology. So the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the big body that produces all these reports warning about climate change, saying we've got to do stuff, and the UK's Committee on Climate Change, which is our own version of that, as it were, independent of government, but it sets out what we need to do. Both of them now say that carbon capture and storage it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, that we won't get to net zero by 2050 without it.
How receptive is the government to this? Because it does sound like it's a pretty good thing. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about planting trees, which sounds like it's pretty much the same thing, but I imagine this is much more, is a larger scale.
There's two sorts of carbon capture and storage. There's the nature-based ones, which is planting trees, restoring peatlands. We all want to do that. There's no controversy about that, and the government's just announced a huge trebling of the tree planting programme, and that's great, and with money attached to make it happen. That's great and good, and that should happen anyway, whatever we do. I like trees just because I like woods. Anyway, this is about what's called engineered carbon capture and storage, also technological carbon capture and storage. The government is very supportive, so they've announced a £1 billion programme, and yesterday they announced two clusters. So there's Hynet in the northwest of England, and there's the northeast cluster in Humberside and Teesside. And that's out of 5. There are 5 proposals from companies to do it. They've chosen the first 2, and they're meant to start. They're now being funded to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it within about 5 years or so.
This sounds like a really impressive and useful thing, because of course it's not going to be that tomorrow we can just remove all carbon from our energy mix, or that particularly when we're facing winter crises and people are really thinking about the increasing bills that they're having to pay to heat their homes. Potentially, this is a as something to do before we roll back and tell people to rip out their boilers is something that is potentially really quite useful.
Well, we absolutely need both. Basically, as I said, we're not going to get to net zero by carbon capture and storage by itself at all, and we need to move away from using fossil fuels for all the sorts of things we use at the moment. But this is something that will make it. We can get to net zero quicker, but we can also get there a lot cheaper. But it is a new technology. There are 26 carbon capture and storage projects around the world in America and Australia and Canada and some in Europe. We don't have them in the UK yet, so we know how to do it. But what we haven't done yet is do it at scale. And the plant in Norway, which is the oldest in the world, it's 1 million tonnes a year. That's great. That's 1 million tonnes a year. The government's ambition is to remove about 20 million tonnes a year by 2030. That's just 9 years away. So we're talking about a lot bigger. But you know how these things work. It's like when we start doing them first, we don't quite know what we're doing. It's a bit expensive. It's a bit difficult. But the more you do it...
There's a lot of innovation to go. And just quickly...
It makes it cheaper and quicker and easier to do.
20 million tonnes of CO2 sounds like a huge amount. How much of that, in terms of our carbon output, does that represent?
At the moment our carbon output's about 500 million tonnes, so it's a relatively small proportion of it, whatever that is. It's 4%, I think.
Well, best of luck with your Westminster Hall debate this afternoon. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this section, but Anthony Browne, Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Environment, thank you very much for joining us here.